Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's HCD webinar series on brand harmony. We are going to give everybody a little bit of time to start to filter in, and then we will begin our discussion. For right now, just hold on as everybody starts to join the meeting. Thank you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the HCD webinar series. We're going to give a little bit more time as people trickle in for today's webinar. So we'll just give it a little bit more time before we begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Michelle Nigella. This is HCD's webinar series that we've been doing now for, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 years at this point. And today's topic is going to be brand harmony, where we will have a frank discussion on cross-functional teams to cross-functional research. We're joined by a great panel of experts to talk about all the different sides of this topic, and I will be introducing them shortly. People are still filtering in to joining the meeting, and I'm so glad to have you here. I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping things and then do a brief intro before we launch into meeting our panelists for today. So without further ado, today's webinar is really focused on this idea of brand harmony. And we're so happy that you can join us. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you're a repeat offender, welcome as well. And feel free to tweet with us during this or after, and visit our blog where we have more research that we've done and writings on this topic, as you can see at the bottom. So a little bit of housekeeping. Please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat function to be able to chat with us. You will be receiving a recording of this webinar as well, and feel free to share that with your colleagues. So you will be receiving that recording later, and we will be uploading that to our YouTube as well if you would like to access it in the future. My name is Michelle Nigella, PhD in Behavioral Neuroscience and VP of Research and Innovation at HCD Research. You can feel free to contact me at the email listed on the screen. For today's topic, this has been something a bit of a passion project for the past few years for HCD, where our fearless leader, Glenn Kessler, the CEO of HCD Research, president, he often comments on whether or not the product meets the promise. And this has been particularly important as our history at HCD has really been started off with doing much of research in the communications marketing area. And when I joined, where my background is a bit more on the R&D side, really started bringing in a lot more research on the R&D side. And we noticed something in this effort that we were doing to help our clients is that often these two groups do not actually meet in the middle. The consumer is getting a final product that is the result of both teams, but in the background, there's often disharmony. And to kind of talk about that a little bit, to introduce this concept, of brand harmony, it's really the idea that for the consumer, you really want a harmonious experience. You want the brand perceptions and what they believe about a brand to really be in harmony and match what their product perceptions are. So again, as Glenn said, you should really make sure that your product that you have or your service really meets the expectations, the promise that you've made in marketing. And this can be a source of disharmony, which leads to dissatisfaction from a consumer, meaning ultimately that products fail. And we do know, particularly in the food area, that new product introductions tend to fail about 80% of the time. Some estimate even more than that. And so that's a huge loss of money and work that's being done. So anything that we can do to sort of correct that problem and ensure that, consumers are in fact, getting what they're expecting to get, based on what they've been told in marketing is really the key to market success. So in order to have this conversation, we felt it was important not to rely on us and our understanding from the research provider side, but really invite a group of speakers, a diverse group of speakers that could speak to things from multiple viewpoints, so both from the marketing side as well as the R&D and sensory side, the insight side, and from a varied background of experiences, including, academic as well as industry, because there has been a lot of research on this topic as well. So without further ado, I'm going to be introducing our speakers, starting with a good friend of mine from the past, Stacy Miller. You'll notice on this panel that there are quite a few Monellians. And when I say Monellians, that's really around, there's a organization called Monell Chemical Senses Institute. It's the leading taste and smell research organization in the world. And that's where I met Stacy originally, and she's had quite the journey since then. Dr. Stacy Miller is currently Senior Manager of Strategic Consumer Insight at Motif, which is a food company. Her research has been focusing on, anything from R&D to marketing, business development, and even innovation. And she's really worked in a variety of positions, R&D as well as sensory insights as well, positions at Motif, but also Simply Safe, Wayfair, Ocean Spray, and IFF. Of course, also her postdoc at Monell Chemical Senses Center. She holds a PhD and master's in psychology and behavioral neuroscience. And we are so happy to have her join us because she's got a very interesting perspective, given that she's kind of been on both sides of the coin. Dr. Linda Flammer, she is also a Monellian, past Monellian, and now, again, a current Monellian, senior research associate at Monell currently. She holds a PhD in psychology as well, working in sensory and R&D at Unilever, IFF, and PepsiCo, where she was really working a lot on validating, new ingredient introductions into current products, as well as new consumer methodologies, focusing on being able to predict market success, which is really what, a huge part of this story is all about. Christoph Knudsen is a career researcher and VP of Insights at Vesta, which provides community-powered marketing. He's an expert in insights. Christoph has been working in research on consumer and brands for well over a decade, particularly with emotional and functional brand communications. So again, very relevant to this topic of really understanding how consumers are interpreting these messages and really applying that to their product experiences. Now, we also have joining us Dr. Yulia Strzenkova, and she is Associate Professor of Marketing at the School of Business at Rutgers University for 12 years now. Her MA and PhD are in marketing communications, where she studies and has been publishing on emerging markets and consumer behavior, particularly for responsible branding, consumer well-being, and response to negative marketplace encounters. So again, very relevant to this topic and from more of that academic side. Finally, we are joined by William Bill Childs. He's creative director at Kitchen Magic. So he's a marketer and creative expert with extensive experience in marketing, communications, creative and graphic marketing arts, and ad design. He's also the author of Child's Play, which is a field guide on creative power. So again, really great to get that creative side, which often we don't get a lot of insight into. And so we thought that that would be a great addition to this panel as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining this webinar. And thank you very much to the panelists for also joining. So I'd love for everybody to start participating in this. And again, please feel free to enter any questions into the chat and we will incorporate that into our conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this so we can see all of us on the screen now. And I want to really start, hi everybody. I want to really start with introducing everybody by talking about which side of the coin you feel you reside in. So in this sort of R&D versus marketing, where do you feel you sit right now? So I'm going to start with Christoph, if you can tell us where you feel you sit at the moment.
Certainly. So I work with insights and market research, and I have been on both sides. So for about 10 years, I ran market research studies more from the product developer and sensory side of things. Now, in my current position at Vesta, where we do more community-powered marketing for brands. So I'm more speaking to brand marketers. And it really is interesting to see on both sides just how much they can maybe not talk to one another and be totally unaware and just going on their own path.
Absolutely. Linda, where do you feel you reside these days?
I think mostly on the development side, although I really have a lot of heart for developing methods that predict market success. You know, one of the reasons that we have an 80 to 90% failure rate, particularly with foods, is because our methods are not good. And I have a lot of heart for that, but most of my experience has been on the development side.
And that's really interesting that you talk about predicting market success, because I think in a lot of organizations, they really rely on marketing and insights to provide that sort of metric. And so it'll be really interesting to talk about that a little bit later about, you know, maybe how that dynamic works, where I know for us being research providers, it's always dangerous to be calling someone's baby ugly, right? But that's essentially what we're being paid to do, right? To call things out and say if they're going to fail. But so sometimes you do have to do that. Now, Stacy, you're kind of similar in some of this that both Christoph and Linda have been talking about, but where do you feel you reside these days? Maybe it's complicated.
I identify as a scientist, but I'm on this strategy team. So I thought I would just put that out there because I feel like I connect at like a deeper level with the R&D teams than I think an average person on the marketing side might, because we have a lot of like the same language and upbringing, given that I was in sensory before, but right now I'm on the strategy team, which sits in the commercialization team. So more of like the demand marketing side of things.
And I think there's something to be brought in here when we're talking about sensory, that sits not exactly in R&D either, right?
Yeah, so I could comment on that because at Motif, my scope is both sensory and consumer insights, which spans both the R&D department as well as the commercialization side. I directly report through commercialization, but I've like nearly got a dotted line to the applications team, which is product development side of B2B. So yeah, but previously when I was at Ocean Spray, I started off on R&D, and then when I was in sensory science, and then went to marketing and consumer insights, and literally they said, "Welcome to the dark side." Was like the CEO said when I like moved over. What did I do?
So maybe we can talk about a little bit later, like what does dark side really mean, or maybe what the CEO intended by that.
But it was a good bridge, yeah.
So, Will, what is your feeling on what side you reside in?
I predominantly live out of the right side of my brain. So, but I appreciate the left side. So I think, there's been creative people get a lot of flack sometimes for kind of just leaning all the way on the side of the creative and making things pretty. But I've been doing this long enough to know that you need both sides. You need both sides of that brain. You need the research. You need to know what the metrics are telling you. But then I'm also the person that gets tasked with deciding and figuring out, well, what does that messaging look like? What are we going to say? What is that brand? What is, all that other stuff that goes into, brand harmony, so that's the side that I live on.
Now, Yulia, when it comes to, the sides, you are in academia, so you're not exactly on, one side of the fence or the other, but your research has been really around branding and the consumer experience. So if you were to choose a side, is it the dark side or not?
Right. So I'm in academia, and most of my research are about consumers and how they perceive brands, right? What signals they get and how they interpret those signals. What happens as they mismatch or what happens, to their expectations, whether they're happy or not. So definitely, I think that's closer to the marketing side, although I did have some research which look at sort of potential new products, but I'm definitely not in the actual, testing products and developing them. My research is on both existing, we did studies with existing brands and existing initiatives, and some are obviously made up just for the purposes of experimentation.
Sure. So, kind of as we've all kind of alluded here, a lot of people describe these two sides as being in silos. And when we say silos, we mean that they really operate independently and don't always communicate with one another, which can lead to issues, right? So if you have marketing conveying one message and the product sort of conveying a different message, this can lead to dissatisfaction on the consumer experience. But then also, if there isn't great communication, it could be who decides what is success, right? Or who decides who decides the research that's being done. So can you think of any everyday examples of this challenge in your workplaces or in your research where you've seen the silos and maybe just an example of that really taking place? I'm going to call out Linda because I know she's thinking about a couple of experiences that she has. And you don't have to name any particular people or companies, but what's an experience you've had where you felt like there were silos where maybe there wasn't great communication between marketing and R&D?
So I worked on a famous beverage brand, and they were going to do a line extension that had the brand Clash. And from a sensory scientist point of view, Clash is bold, it's very in your face. And so the first thing that we did was we had consumers select what colors would be associated with the brand name Clash. And they picked very vivid, bold colors. The flavor that the product developers went with was a blueberry flavor. And so they ended up picking a very bold blue, almost neon color, which went well with Clash. As the development cycle happened, everything passed our hurdles on the R&D side. We sent it over to marketing, and somebody in marketing was afraid of the vivid blue color because there had been previously a launch of a beverage that was blue that failed. And so they switched it, the blueberry flavored product, to orange, and they named it acai, and they picked a very pale color, and it failed miserably because there was no communication at all. So complete mismatch of the sensory, and did not live up to the promise. The elements were not Clash.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the brief that you got on R&D was really completely different than what was going on in marketing altogether.
Correct.
Yeah. Has anybody else had some experiences like that?
That almost sounded like it was just one person. Was it Linda? That there was a lot of, it sounded like a lot of thought and care went into like the synergies of like the sound and the taste and the flavor. And then like just one person along the way somehow like unravels it.
It could have been,
Which
but I
speaks to the communication.
think there was just nervousness around launching another blue beverage, because a previous blue beverage, which would have failed because colas are not blue.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. That's really tough because like you said, you meet all the hurdles on one side where you're fulfilling the brief. You know, in our position working as a research provider, it's always been challenging because we certainly try to bring in the marketing brief into our research to make sure that it's going to be fitting the ultimate goal. You know, that should be part of the action standards for moving forward. But of course, you have to have that communication from the marketing team. Can you think of situations where it's been successful that you feel like you worked really well with a marketing team?
Since it's that same color thing, I will say it was a project at IFF. And the brief was for Polo Blue, the men's cologne. And what happened in the consumer testing there, when we asked people to smell the fragrances, rate liking, one of the fragrances scored higher in liking than another one. But that fragrance, 100% of the people did not pick blue to describe that fragrance. They picked greens, purples, and blues. The other fragrance was a little bit less liked, but 100% of consumers said this is blue. And that's the one that we went with. And that became the #1 selling men's fragrance that year.
Oh, wow.
Everything
That's really interesting.
together.
Yeah, I think so much, you know, you were talking about, you know, we've talked before about creating better ways to predict market success. And I think for the most part, people do rely on liking as being the ultimate decider. But we know from classic examples such as, you know, the Pepsi challenge, right, where unbranded Coke is not the winner. Branded, it's a completely different experience, right? Because people have brand loyalty. And all those emotions that come in with it. So they can certainly like the taste a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be success. Christoph, it looked like you had something to add.
I can speak to that. So I've had an experience where I worked for a major food corporation that had run market research. You know, this is over a decade ago, but they essentially passed on the opportunity to be ahead of the line in terms of Greek yogurt, precisely because it underperformed on their basic liking tests, not getting into the, you know, what the experience, you know, the differentiating experience that Greek yogurt could provide, and relying strictly on those liking scores absolutely failed them in that case.
And in cases with like Greek yogurt, I mean, it's pretty obvious that regular yogurt is going to be liked more on a basic taste test because it's simply sweeter. Right. So it's just going to be liked more.
It also just has to do with like how you approach the research. Like at some places I've been, it'll be all R&D and sensory, and then there's almost like a handoff to marketing, which is then to say like it's been tested unbranded the whole time, right? Liking is driving the scores, so you make it like super sweet, right? Because sugar and sweetness always do well. But the whole proposition was to make like a lighter, like low sugar drink. So it just ends up, you know, or I mean, the problem could happen in the reverse where marketing has intentionally, and these are not made up stories here, but marketing has intentionally hidden the fact that there's like stevia, or that it's like a different sweetness formulation, hidden that on pack to drive broader trial, But with broader trial and like no
For
set
your disappointment.
expectations, especially if the brand is like known for having like full mouthfeel and sweetness, then
And you're wondering like, why does this taste not right? Right.
yeah. So it's
But if
like,
you
so
knew it had
what
stevia
has,
in it, your expectations would be for stevia and your liking would change accordingly.
and it's just, what are you sacrificing? Like broad
Yeah.
reach for like higher expectation matching. And I think part of the problem, like in these like silos, it could be like R&D working on a widget that has no market, but alternatively, it could be marketing developing unicorn concepts that have no no place in reality, right? Like sugar-free something that tastes just like sugar.
And that might be an interesting spot to bring Will into the conversation, because being on that creative side where he's maybe getting, you know, a brief, right? So when it comes to something like that, have you had an experience where maybe you're not briefed on everything that's, you know, like it has stevia, this is a big, you know, potential influencer on the consumer experience. But how have you handled situations like that?
Well, I'll take a different approach.
Mhm.
I'll use an example that I wasn't involved in, but that we're all familiar with. Look at the show Seinfeld,
Mhm.
okay? Research on Seinfeld said, do not put this show on the air. No one will watch it. It's about nothing, okay?
Mhm.
Seinfeld is now a part of our culture. There are people that like spend their days like using Seinfeld references. But the research, and I'm not knocking research, but the research would basically say this show is unwatchable.
Right.
Don't put this on the air. We are going to lose money. Advertisers are not going to support it. And quite honestly, it struggled for 3 years. It even struggled out of the gate. It was a mid-summer replacement. It was like a 13 episode commitment. So I'd like to know, even from the panel, like, what do you do about those types of things? You know, how do you handle
Yeah.
that? Where it's like,
And that's like the $1 million question is there is no good predictive score that you can do, right? If you rely on something like liking, you're really just doing a measure of mediocrity because it's not going to be innovative, right? You're not going to get something new because people like what they're familiar with more. Familiarity can drive liking very much.
somebody's got to
But
take a chance, right? Someone has to take a chance and
Exactly.
say,
Yeah.
no, we're putting this on the air. I believe in it. I believe what it's trying to do. But yet the research is saying, don't do it. You know, it's going to be terrible. It's
Yeah,
gonna be awful.
I think it has to do with like having an anchor of like expectations, right? And so like I don't think it's about like no research, but when is the research happening, right? It's like Herman Miller's Aeron chair was solving a problem that nobody solved, like but it was based on a pain point. And so like the research was like far before the design, right? The research was around how like people were all of a sudden sitting in offices now for a really long time.
Yeah.
And like having a literal pain point. And like everybody just kept making softer chairs and like things that like still hurt your back, and they didn't quite understand it. And when Herman Miller's Aeron chair came out, it looked so different. It solved the problem, but it looked so unfamiliar that there was no anchor. There was no anchor of like, what is this? And so there was like this outright rejection at like the focus groups, like people are just like rejecting this thing. But when they tried it, like seeing is believing, right? Somebody took a bet that it actually did solve the problem and that the problem was real and based on research. And it, well, that's the office chair now that we all know.
So how can where are opportunities you see for organizations to sort of improve upon this communication, right? Because like sometimes there is a brand manager who just is going off of liking scores or just decides they like the blue more, and they make the decision ultimately regardless, you know. So how do you have you seen in your experiences ways to help organizations find opportunities to like improve upon the communication? Is it possible to break down the silos?
I will speak maybe from the academic side here, but I think what's important is to have a vision. I think that's something that is getting lost. You know, we do need research, and in academia now we rely on multi-methods, so that it's not only experiments or not only big data or not only interviews or focus groups, but you integrate. But I think for a brand, it's really important to have that vision, right? And know who you are. And that has to match the product, obviously, right? But to say, okay, we only rely on liking score. Well, at the end of the day, especially consumer products, a lot of them are parity products. There are no differences among them, right? Those or the differences are so small. So we mentioned 80% of products failing. Well, a lot of them people may like, and they do like, but they just are not getting more than what the product is, right? They need to get that message about what the brand is and to have that consistent message. So I think, and that boils down to the vision of who you are as a brand. And I would say nowadays, that's a very important issue with all of the fragmented media, even more so, right? With social media, TikTok, people taking your brand, taking your product. But if you have a consistent vision and message, that's much harder to break and to, end up with failures and disappointments.
And it's very much an organizational issue, right? So if you have a vision, how do you go about communicating with the siloed arms of your organization when you're working on, say, a new market introduction?
The places that I think have done really well, they are not these siloed organizations. And so having worked on the supplier side, I was able to see different ways that organizations launched new products. And so a couple of different companies would have everyone organized around the product premise. And instead of R&D doing their work and then passing the torch over to marketing once the product has been finalized, it was from the beginning, everybody was on the same project team and they were all in it together. Success or failure was for the whole team. And it required that team was willing to critique each other and critique each other honestly in each of the roles that people played. But successful products have come out of that. And I think the way that our food companies are structured, with marketing on one division with separate budgets, separate leaders, and then R&D on the other side, it's just doomed to continue with failures until there is a dramatic paradigm shift in that.
Yeah, and it is kind of like a paradigm shift. I know there are some efforts to have even software that is implemented that helps teams organize better to make sure that there's players from all corners of an organization, right? That it has to be signed off on, or it has to include sensory, it has to include development, it has to include creative and insights and all these different people. So there's a stakeholder for each silo. And then that's a little bit of an effort. Have you seen personally this play? I know maybe this plays a little bit more in the tech industry that I've seen this, but when it comes to more consumer products, have you seen any efforts to really organize in those ways? Stacy, I saw some nodding.
Yeah, I've seen it range anywhere from, it's true, like at Wayfair, they had pods, which were like totally dedicated to like solving a problem or building a product in the software world. So they're pods and they all sat together. And I'll come back to that sitting together because I think that's an important piece. I've seen like cross-functional teams where like, just like you were saying, one representative from each person like meets for the project like weekly. I think that's better than a handoff. But I think where I've seen it work the best is when they had a separate innovation team who like had fun together, ate together, sat together, worked together. But the innovation team was kind of like a bubble within the broader siloed organization, where it was kind of doing what Linda was saying CPG should do, which is like it had one member from like every function in this innovation team, and they worked on many different things. But I think that fun piece is important because you build the empathy, and without the empathy and the like, that you can't have those challenging conversations that Yulia was saying, which really like, you may be the one that has the most important thing to say. And if you don't feel comfortable saying it, like, what good are you doing to the project?
Yeah. And I guess talking about, this idea of brand harmony, we've really been describing it as, as I said, like Glenn says, ensuring that the product meets the promise. And for us at HCD as consumer researchers, this really means helping our clients do spot checks to make sure that along the process of product development and going to market, that the marketing message and mix and the product experience are sort of working towards a cohesive goal, with a relevant brand image. So it's not even just that it's the brand image that's being fed to you by marketing, but really ensuring that that is relevant to the consumer. So in that sort of frame, what do you think are the biggest challenges to creating brand product harmony for brand companies? Is it really the communication issue, or is there, maybe even something deeper in understanding about, consumer needs?
Well, they need to have common ground. And I think besides the silos, a big mistake a lot of companies have is they decide for themselves what they feel like their brand means to their consumers, or they don't feel like they need to do the research. And what I found is the common ground is the emotional experience, or it can be conceptual. I've had things like premium versus sensibly value is not necessarily emotional, but it's definitely a conceptual idea. And that's something that can be tested on both the marketing side and the product development side to make sure that there is a match and there is that harmony.
I think that's a really good point to bring up, and kind of leads to something that I heard Will talk about on a previous conversation that we had. Here I am talking about a relevant brand image. Maybe you can speak to what you were telling us before about what a brand or company thinks they are versus what they really are.
Oh, the old paradigm of marketing or branding used to be, advertisers would tell customers what they are. Now that's totally reversed. The customers tell the brands what they are. And if that's out of alignment, you're going to have problems. And I think the thing that you're referring to is, I don't think a lot of companies even know what they're selling. I don't even think they know the product or the service that they're selling. I used an example of Harley Davidson. I said, if I asked you what Harley Davidson sold and you told me motorcycles, I would say you're wrong. They sell freedom. Okay. That's a much bigger construct than just a bunch of parts that fit together with two wheels and you go and you buy. Everybody, the other brands make motorcycles. Harley leans in 100% on freedom. And if you don't believe me, go look at their ads. You can tie every single one of their ads and all of their touch points and all of their marketing back to freedom, because that's the emotion that they know that their customers are buying. You can buy a Kawasaki, but you're not buying that same ethos that you get when you buy a Harley. And you can really do this with any type of brand. One thing I was saying too is, I said, if I owned a mattress store, I would not sell mattresses. I would refocus all my marketing to selling a good night's sleep. And I can use data for that. I can use research on what that all means by what you get out of getting a good night's sleep. Oh, and by the way, I happen to sell mattresses that can help you get that good night's sleep, right? So you can really do that with any kind of brand, and look at what are they really selling, and that should really align with what the customers believe they are selling as well, or their potential customers are selling.
And that can change, right? Sure. So thinking of some other examples that exist out there when you think about brand harmony and people that are trying to change their brand image, because it really is, again, that brand perception versus the product experience. So let's take an example like Buick, right? So Buick has been historically seen as being an older car, an old-fashioned car, an out-of-date kind of car. But they've really made a push the past few years to become a modern luxury brand. And I would argue they've actually been fairly successful at that with their marketing. So do you think that they can move from this perception of being like old-fashioned or not cool to being cool? Is that too much of a stretch, and how do you gauge that?
It can be a stretch. Look at what Subaru was trying to do. Subaru, you say Subaru, everyone says safety. Oh yeah, safety. That's what they sold for years. Now they're trying to be outdoorsy and adventure, and which that's a disconnect. Jeep seems to own that, right? That kind of sense. But yeah, so it can be tricky. It can be really tricky. I know for me personally, the one thing that I saw that connected with me the most, and you will never get me to give up my Mac, is the Apple Think Different campaign. When I saw that campaign, I saw myself in that company. So Apple, and they know this, they can charge 1,000 times more for their computer than they can for a PC, and I will pay for it because that brand knows me. That brand knows what I'm about, what I'm trying to do. So you can, I'm always going to be a Mac guy, an Apple guy, because of what that company projects and what they put out. Just go watch that Think Different commercial.
It's part of your identity.
100%, right. You're not going to, I will, if you're going to force me to use a PC, I'll quit my job. I'll go change careers. I don't identify in any way with a PC. No way, not happening.
And so a lot of this has been about the personality. Sorry, Christoph, go ahead.
I was going to say there will always be instances where a brand will try to maybe shift their perception. They want to move somewhere from where they currently are, or they want to expand their offerings. And I think it's not to say that you can't do that, but you definitely have to tread carefully. I think an important thing to consider is you can't go after something like we're going to be the luxury brand, we're going to be the modern brand without giving something up in the process.
Right.
Again, it speaks to that identity. You really can only be known for a small handful of things. When a consumer thinks of your brand, it's going to be this, and that's one of the other things I've seen is or mistakes that brands make is they think they can have it all. Yeah, right. We want to be comforting, we want to be exciting, we want to be luxury, we want to be a good value. No. Pick one of those things.
Yeah.
That's so, you can make that move, but I think first you have to see how close and how far, are you making too much of a stretch from where you have to consider like a map, this is where our brand currently is, this is where we want to be. And again, consider, first you have to fully commit to that move. And you also have to be very clear that, again, you're going to move in that direction. You're probably moving away from certain things that people.
So how do you know what you are though? So here's your brand identity. How do you determine, what the consumer is feeling? I mean, are companies really listening enough to the consumer? I say this in a lot of talks that I've given in the past at different conferences, that most of the research in the past 50 years has really focused on product and ignored the consumer. I think we're coming into a world where we're starting to focus more on the consumer, and so there are new methodologies that are focusing more on that consumer experience. And Christoph, to your point, really focusing on emotions, for example, and in looking at perceptions. So, what have you found to be good ways to really listen to the consumer's perceptions?
Again, you've got to collect that consumer feedback. You've got to be asking those sort of questions about, I've been working with, a hair care brand that is actively in the process of trying to define their identity. So I will say that they've definitely been doing the right things in terms of running research, trying to get at, okay, when you first discovered our brand, what did that do for you and what did it mean for you? And again, getting into that, conceptual and experience and not just,
Yeah, I like the experience idea, because getting to Will's point about, Harley Davidson not being about motorcycles, but being about freedom. How do you get to freedom?
Authenticity.
Go ahead, Bill.
I just wanted to say one word: authenticity.
Yeah. Well,
that's a hard thing to measure. Go ahead.
But
Stacy.
it's not like people, like Bill was saying, it wasn't like people were telling Harley Davidson they had to stand for freedom, right? And I think as Christopher's hair care brand that he's working with is exploring their identity. They're probably thinking about it hopefully from a number of different angles, right? What is our business strategy with the brand, right? And how does that intersect with the social, political, climate moment in the world, the macro sociological place that we're in right now. And then like, where do we have a right to play? Where are we differentiated? What, you know what I mean? Like, so I think like there's really this complicated Venn diagram, and it's not just like, who do the consumers want us to be, right? That's a little weak, right? That seems flighty. Then your consumer changes what you change, as opposed to having it be like this intersectionality of like where we are right now. Where's our company right now? Where have we been? Where are we
What sort of
going?
tools have people used to sort of, identify that? Is it, qualitative focus groups? Is it social listening? What have you found to be useful in identifying that?
Well, I think it always starts with like, what is your strategy with the brand? And like, sometimes you have a whole conversation about whether you need a sub brand, right? Which becomes like even more complicated. But like, what's your strategy? If your strategy is to age down, you're going to have like a totally different like conversation than if your strategy is to like get people to buy one more, right? So I think like in the absence of these conversations and understanding exactly like what outcome you're trying to drive, like it's hard to do the rest. But yeah, so in the case of age down, to bring it like to like Will's world, Ocean Spray had a campaign that I was at Ocean Spray when they transitioned from like the 2 men in the bog, the actors, to what's currently out there right now, which is a more authentic like story that tells about the co-op, that it's grower owned, but it was all originated from wanting to age down from boomers to millennials, right? And fundamentally the need of millennials to have transparency. But that we didn't just invent that we were grower owned. We were grower owned, and that was like a big thing, that there was a gap to people knowing about that. So like a traditional brand tracker showed us that like that authenticity is important, and grower owned was a perception
that consumer led then
weren't known. But the strategy was there first. We knew we wanted to age down. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
And then it was like, then you have to understand like, what are the gaps in our perceptions of like what we do own, what we can say that people aren't aware of. Right. I don't know.
So let's say you are, looking for that authenticity. You are Harley Davidson, and you're trying to be seen as freedom, right? Of selling freedom. How can you test that you're actually doing that?
I really like to rely on a lot of nonverbal techniques. I think, focus groups are fraught with someone being dominant in the group, leading the conversation, people, chiming in, following. So there's so much psychology to the group dynamic that a focus group really is not very meaningful. But I think a lot of nonverbal ways, asking people, hundreds of consumers, to select images that represent the brand and see what that looks like. You had mentioned earlier, I think, Michelle, about social listening. I think there's a lot of rich data when people are not cognizant that you're reading their information from the point of view of trying to understand new things about your product. They're just tweeting to their friend, look, I put fried pickles on my Doritos, and now I've created this new snack that I absolutely love. So I think there's a lot of verbal information that we could use, but I don't think the structured verbal information is all that helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and Christoph, this probably plays into some of your interests as well, about the role of emotion plays in this equation, about measuring these things that are not the standard questions, right? The standard survey, finding ways to get around that. I know we've worked very closely with Christoph on using some implicit measurements, for example, as well as emotional measurements to sort of gauge those responses. So maybe you can comment on how you see that as well, these additional tests that can be done that go sort of beyond the verbal.
Sure. Now I am actually more of a believer in the verbal, but of course we've done the implicit association. I've done max diff and other approaches as well, but really just trying to get at that association. We mentioned with focus group, I'm willing to bet with the Harley Davidson experience that if we were to have someone ride on a Harley Davidson and then have them sit, have them drive a Toyota, and then we were to do some association exercises about how, how they felt experiencing that, I'm willing to bet that something like freedom or excitement or bold and adventurous is going to come across as more associated with that, whereas reliable, comforting, smooth is going to come up more with driving a Toyota. And just having those sort of associative exercises that can again, just be running these tests and asking these questions is such an important thing, and talking to your consumers something that that brands need to consider.
Physiologically, Michelle, how do you think their heart rate would differ on the Harley versus in the Camry?
that would be, that would be one of the nonverbal ways.
Yeah, I'm sure you could, see differences on people's expressions even when they're riding on a Harley Davidson potentially rather than driving in a Honda Civic, right?
Michelle, I got a question. We've been talking about brands that are succeed. I would love to know this. There's two examples that I have of brands that did some promotions that could not have been more of a swing and a miss. And that's the Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad, where she hands and the Peloton bike ad, if we all remember that one, for the Christmas present one. I just wondered what some of the feedback is on just that. There had to been research. How was there no research that came up in those brands that said, you know what, maybe this might not be a good approach to try to have Kendall Jenner hand a can of Pepsi to a cop at a riot.
And I think a lot of times people do rely on focus groups. And so, to Linda's point, I think you can have something that's missed, right? Because you could have people that are in the focus group that are sort of dominating that situation, or maybe certain emotions don't come up. But you also can't measure what you don't test, right? So even in using some of these emotional or associative tests, if you don't ask if it's freedom, you're not going to know if it's freedom. If you don't ask if it's going to make you angry, then we're not going to know if it's angry. So I don't know. Does anybody else have any thoughts on how you can catch something like that before it's launched?
I also just think, like, probably building on Linda's comment of like the social commentary in a focus group being maybe a negative thing in the testing world, it probably contributed to a lot of like the downfall of those ads in the real world, right? Like that maybe it was a minority of people. Like if they had done some robust testing, maybe it was like 1 or 2% of people who saw this negative thing. But now in the real world, when you've launched it on the Super Bowl, this small group is like so loud on Twitter, and like then it builds and it feeds and it fuels and it echoes and like becomes greater than it ever would have been in research because of the time and moment and how it played out in the real world.
But with Super Bowl, we also need to remember that a lot of those ads might have thought about creating just the controversy. And I think they just, sometimes you can do too much of a controversy. I think with Pepsi, that might have been, I think, the initial, idea. I'm not sure. I don't have that information.
Like a calculated risk.
Right. So they might have just didn't expect it to be that risky. But, you wanted to have some controversy to get the publicity and all that other stuff. So I think we need to have more information to know for sure what went wrong. But just going back to the question of how we can get to emotions, I think nowadays we also have a lot of that online textual big data where you can sort of try and uncover a lot of the things, and you can actually measure, values, or you can measure emotional words, emotionality of a sentence, and so on. But I do like Stacy's point early on. I think when we talk about big data, it's important to remember that we still need to think about some strategy. I think what we see a lot, you can find anything there. You can find any correlations, any relationships. So it's important to have some sort of a strategy and know what exactly I'm looking for, and sort of say, okay, yes, it makes sense, whatever I'm finding, or no, it may just be some random noise. And I think if you have resources, I understand there's all resources, but using multi-method and robust checks, right? And
Sure.
engaging social listening. You can
Let's
also
say
access
you-
imagery on Instagram, for example. It doesn't have to be just words, right? Images also speak to that.
But all these methods, and it is important to do multi-methods, right? To have a lot of different inputs on both explicit and implicit and emotional and qual and quant, and all these different things are very informative, but each has their own pitfalls. And so we do have an interesting question here about how do you balance those benefits, from different sort of testing, and really understanding that people can be really poor at explaining their own feelings. So things that you might be getting from social listening, even looking at the sort of emotional responses that they're having, positive or negative, can misinform to some degree as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, if your success metrics are changing emotions, maybe you answer the question differently than if your success metrics were causing a controversy, right? So I think that plays a role as well.
Absolutely.
So
your action standards to say that something is a success is key for sure.
With the Pepsi ad, I think it comes back to this point about authenticity. And I've been talking with this idea of brand harmony with my team, and what things that have come up. I mean, there are new challenges for brands because they're actually expected in a lot of ways nowadays to comment on social issues.
Yes.
But something that came up was, and this is a totally different type of brand disharmony, but a brand that vocalized their support for Black Lives Matter, for example, only for it to be found out that they have no African Americans on their board, or their hiring practices are not friendly. They were in a way being they were being internally inconsistent, not
inauthentic. Yeah.
So, and I think in the case of the Pepsi ad, it may have been, an assessment of, is this really, what are you trying to say here? And does this truly align authentically with your brand's values? And they might have, with some research, they might have determined, hey, we sell sugar water and no one really wants to hear how we feel about this social justice issue. It's certainly not this way.
Interesting. Yeah, and I guess a quick question for Yulia. In academia, do you feel that the idea of brand harmony is being taught to students that are going to be going into industry potentially and dealing with these issues?
We have been for a very long time talking about brand marketing communications as integrated. I think right now we are switching gears more toward brands and how do we integrate this product proposition, brand proposition with all of the marketing communications later on, right, at later stages. So yes, definitely, at least in my courses, I definitely do emphasize that.
And this could be more challenging, right? And this could be, a place for Bill to weigh in on as well, that the advertising landscape is changing, right? And drastically so, where I think advertising as an entire field is experiencing a paradigm shift with moving into a digital space. You no longer have a captive 30-second audience, right? People are not watching advertisements. And so being able to communicate a product experience is nearly impossible. So when we think about visual attention and inserting in sensory elements. I've been playing around this idea of sensory memes. We've all seen the memes that say you can smell this picture or you can hear this picture. But that's basically what brands have to do now, because if it's only going to be shared for a split second on TikTok or, something that somebody shared, how can you communicate effectively something that you had 30 seconds to do to tell a whole story, and you no longer have that? So what do you see in the future for what happens to brand harmony and brand communications of experience and perception?
Well, if I can jump in on this, there was a book written a couple of years ago by a guy named David Schenck. It was called Data Smog, where he analyzed just all the noise that's in the market. So he concluded that there was about an average of about 5,000 messages a day that the average consumer sees on a daily basis. That could be anything that distracts your attention. So it could be television, radio, billboards, web ads, email, whatever, 5,000 a day. I would say about 4, and I'm being exaggerating here, probably about 4,500 of them are meaningless, maybe even higher. Because so many advertisers do this thing that I call advert panicking, where they're not advertising, they're just advert panicking. They're throwing up things on messages. They don't even know if it's going to work. They're just like, let's see if it sticks, and they're trying it in real time.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, the thing that will never change or should never change in marketing is emotion and authenticity. And I'll reference that Think Different ad. There is no way anyone is going to convince me that doing an ad without showing the product. First of all, none of those people in that ad ever saw a computer and even knew what one was. And you never showed the product. Now, that makes no sense at all, right? But yet, that spoke to an entire generation of people that thought, yeah, you know what? I do see myself as someone that wants to change the world. Apple.
Yeah, and all that can be conveyed in such a simplistic message.
Right. I mean, the Apple board itself said to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, you are not putting that commercial on the air. And the famous story is Jobs turned to Wozniak and said, I'll pay for half if you do. And they went to their agency, Chiat Day. They made them, there were 4 commercials that were scheduled. They canceled all of them but one in the 3rd quarter, and it ran, and it changed the world.
And I think that tells us something. I mean, the
Right.
advertising field is changing, and you do have to take risks to be able to change with it. We can't stay in these old methodologies and these old metrics. I know Stacy has a hard stop at 1, so I want to grant her the ability to say, I want to say thank you to you if you need to jump off. And, you know, maybe we have just a couple minutes here for the rest of you to sort of weigh in on final thinking about the future. So if each of you could weigh in on what you think the future can hold, you know, when we're thinking about that exactly, Bill, how the landscape is changing and we do have to match that experience to what's being communicated, what you see in the future in your crystal ball.
I see search and voice being huge, because we're all on these things.
Yeah.
It's all a matter of, now you just ask the question. So voice search, and you know, companies have to be in that space. You have to be willing to answer those questions that consumers are going to have about your brand, whether they're good or bad. You got to
because where are they going to find you?
And answer them. You know, we're working on that right now inside Kitchen Magic, about you know answering questions for people that might be uncomfortable about our product and our services. Right. But giving them that information, because that's what they demand. That's what they need in order to make a decision.
That's a really interesting point. I like that, the search. Linda, your thoughts on the future?
I think if companies don't align those silos, they'll be weeded out and will ultimately fail in the future. And I think that things like transparency are becoming more and more important. And companies have to step up for sustainability and for diversity and inclusion.
These bigger ideas.
And all of those bigger things are going to make or break their brands.
Sure. Yulia, you want to comment on that as well in the future?
Yes, I think, you know, you mentioned 30-second TV spots are no longer all that important. And I think exactly for that reason, brand harmony is even more important, because, you know, we need to think how to make sure we have that consistency and alignment. And I completely agree with what Linda was saying. You know, it's about your product, brand, social issues, everything, right? And you have to pack it. If you're on TV somewhere, it's 5 seconds now, right? Before you can skip the ads. So that's what people may watch, at least. But you have to think about the what used to be called non-traditional methods, really, right? You know, now I think they are the traditional, should be the traditional methods.
Yeah.
But absolutely, I think harmony, that would make it or break it for a lot of, especially startups and smaller companies.
To break through. Yeah. Christoph, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, again, with so many, so little time to grab consumers' attention, so many different things competing for their attention, it's going to be all the more important to drill down to specifically what experience are we providing to consumers that they're not going to get somewhere else, get that to a succinct core message and make sure that that is in every chance you do get to get attention, that gets continually reinforced with every decision that you make.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, all the panelists for joining in this conversation, and everybody who's dialed into this meeting. Thank you so much for your participation. We will have the recording available, and if you would like to contact any of the speakers, feel free to reach out to us. I see there is one more question about neuromarketing techniques. We don't have time to answer it, but please, Ravina, please feel free to reach out to us directly, and we will talk to you more about that. So without further ado, thank you everybody for your participation. Have a great day, and feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to have further conversations with any of the panelists or ourselves. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.